Welcome to Group 1's synopsis of Against the Tide, One Woman's Political Struggle. This book is the personal story of South Carolina State Representative Harriet Keyserling and her struggle to break into the good old boy network that was the South Carolina State Legislature in the mid-1970s and into the 1980s. It chronicles her fight to gain acceptance, ensure public interest overcomes special interests, and build relationships necessary to be an effective leader, advocate, and legislator. In order to understand the environment that Harriet was entering when she decided to run for political office, we must first understand some of the history and background of the state. South Carolina was one of the original 13 colonies and gained its independence from British rule in 1776. On March 26, 1776, the state government was created and the state constitution was signed. The state government is set up in the traditional three-branch system, with a governor serving as the executive, a judiciary branch, and a legislature made up of the Senate with 46 members and the House of Representatives with 124 members. The legislature session runs for approximately 6 months each year in the South Carolina capital of Columbia. Historically, the governor of South Carolina has been viewed as the weakest state executive in the United States. The legislative branch holds most of the power in the state, controlling the budget process, making government appointments, and running state agencies. This power in the legislature makes the Speaker of the House and President of the Senate two of the state's most influential officials. The history of South Carolina is one that is rich in culture and turmoil. Some people believe the state to be the essence of the Southern spirit. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union prior to the start of the Civil War. It took almost till the year 2000 for the state legislature to remove the Confederate flag from its state capitol building. And today the flag controversy still rages on, both in-state and in national media markets. In 1880, the Jim Crow laws were enacted, limiting the rights of African Americans in the state and creating public segregation. The laws were enforced in South Carolina until the mid-1960s with the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected African American rights to vote. On July 1st, 1969, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was finally ratified by South Carolina, and women were allowed to vote. The mid to late 1960s dramatically impacted the political culture in South Carolina, injecting new ideas, new candidates, and new voters to the political environment. The two major industries in South Carolina are textiles and agriculture. The agricultural industry in the past relied heavily on slave labor and huge plantations. It was the families that owned these plantations or ran the textile mills that provided the most influential people in the state, often supporting politicians that were willing to maintain the status quo. South Carolina also falls in line with the traditional political culture that was introduced by political scientist David Elazar and was discussed in our Week 1 lecture notes. Elazar states that family ties are prominent where traditional political culture is found. This often means that some families run the government while others have a little to say about it. This reflects an older attitude that embraces hierarchical society as part of the natural order. Government is seen as an actor with a positive role in the community, but the role is largely limited to securing the maintenance of the existing social order. Political leaders play a largely conservative and custodial role rather than being innovative. Otherwise, limited government is viewed as best because that is all that is required to meet the needs of those in power. Status quo politics, such as seen in the traditional political culture model described by Elazar, allows a few people to gain power and maintain control over the agenda, often to the detriment of the public interest. South Carolina proved their resistance to change time and time again, as discussed in previous slides. As Harriet entered the political picture, many leaders in the establishment pushed against her campaign, thinking that she may create too many waves and disrupt the natural order. They were right. The following slides show a distinct look at the differences between Elazar's three political culture models. First, South Carolina, with its traditional culture highlighted by the social hierarchy, resistance to change. Second, we have Minnesota, representing the moral culture in which a greater good is the most important thing. This seems to be the most optimistic view of politics. Lastly, we have New Jersey, representing the individualistic model, where the private sector is more important than the public interest. Government is instituted for utilitarian purposes. This model holds the most cynical view of government. Since the area of Reconstruction, the state government of South Carolina operated not much as a two-party system, but rather as one major party controlled by an established group of leaders. When Harriet was first elected to the House, Republicans only held 12 seats. Within this one-party system, there were many different groups or caucuses with differing views on a wide array of issues. The leadership was able to control the legislature by maintaining a tight control over the agenda. As Professor Schenck discussed in week 3, if you can successfully control the rules, you can control the process, and then you can control the outcome. If you understand this process, you have a leg up on the competition. The status quo was often a point of contention throughout the legislative process. The history of South Carolina showed that more often than not, leadership and decision making was left up to the top of the social, economic, and political structures, while the lower classes were left out of the discussion almost altogether. In order for one group to move up the ladder, it is essential for others to move down. This shift in status quo becomes hotly contested, as relatively few groups are willing to relinquish power and influence to others, especially if that means their interests may suffer. Any opposition to the will of the elite was often met by political maneuvering by the old guard. This was the world that Harriet Keyserling was entering in the mid-1970s. As discussed on the previous slide, within the South Carolina legislature, there were a number of factions that were constantly either battling with each other or joining forces in temporary alliances to garner votes. During Mrs. Keyserling's time at the House, she was forced to deal directly with each of these groups, sometimes as allies, other times as adversaries. The first group includes the then Speaker of the House, Sol Blatt, and his old guard. These were powerful men that held the leadership positions and resisted change of the status quo. They were legislators that best exemplified the traditional political culture that was discussed earlier. The second were the Young Turks. This group was in favor of modernizing the state of South Carolina and were often a natural ally to Mrs. Keyserling and the Crazy Caucus member. Lastly, there was Harriet and her Crazy Caucus. This group was like-minded individuals made up the more liberal base of the South Carolina Democrats, and they were consistently at conflict with the establishment, the old guard, the fat and uglies, and the Republicans. They were constantly struggling to upset the establishment and fought for the public interest over private interests. The Southern culture very much favored the old boys club as the preferred way of doing business. This was the best option to maintain the status quo. However, as the times were changing and new voters and candidates were introduced, the old way of doing things was under constant barrage. This did not mean change happened quickly, as Harriet found out. Many barriers still existed for women looking to enter the political arena. Barriers included psychological factors, fundraising, lifestyle, public perception, and political understanding. Psychological factors included the lack of footprints to follow. A woman entering the race must break the precedent and go against usual expectations. Secondly, campaigns cost a lot of money, and most women at the time did not have an independent income. They hated asking for money, or they were not considered sure winners, and thus financial support from the party was rare. When it comes to lifestyle, traditional roles of women and mothers are to keep the family first. Running for public office is time-consuming, and it can put a strain on a family. This strain often prevents women from running an effective campaign or running at all. As one progresses up the political ladder, the time constraints become even more severe. Public perception also becomes a huge hurdle, especially in the more socially conservative southern states, where it is widely believed that a woman's place was at home. The last major hurdle that is discussed, and that Mrs. Keyserling faced when she attended her first session in Columbia, is that of political barriers. The political process is extremely complex and intimidating, and at the time, most women were untrained in political strategy, rules and decorum, or the political process. Rosenthal argues that the significance of personal relationships should be obvious to anyone familiar with the legislative process. Without trust, credibility, and veracity in the dealings among individuals, the process could hardly work at all. The success of Harriet Keyserling's political career can be measured in her relationships. Throughout her impactful and illustrious career, Keyserling's relationship with her family, colleagues, community, church, and schools kept her motivated to making a difference. Keyserling's success and experiences also helped her establish influential relationships in politics, helped create the South Carolina Women in Government to state and local appointed positions. It was these relationships, both in Columbia and at home in Beaufort, that allowed her to remain an effective leader for 16 years. Even as liberal Democrats in an ever increasingly Republican district, she managed to survive two challenges to her seat in the House. In her first session, Mrs. Keyserling decided to throw caution to the wind and introduced a bill that would affect the waiting period to buy a firearm. The bill ultimately failed, but Mrs. Keyserling quickly learned a valuable lesson as to the power of a strong lobby. During her first session, she also learns there is no such thing as an uncontroversial bill. When she was working behind the scenes to get a bill passed, someone else on the other side was working just as hard against her efforts. With these lessons in tow, Harriet became a fanatic on building commissions, coalitions, and task forces. She fostered relationships with lobbyists, colleagues, and community and industry leaders, and on occasion even the governor. She tirelessly worked the floor of the House, often with the help of other crazy caucus members or other allies helping where they could. During her time in the legislature, she had many successes, but also many failures, but that never dampened her drive or desire to fight for what she felt was in the best interest of her district or the state of South Carolina. The legislature can be quite overwhelming for any newcomer. The pace at which the proceedings occur, the complexity of the rules, and the intensity of the debates can all leave a freshman and even some veterans in a daze. Mrs. Keyserling described watching the happenings on the House floor in her first year with a wide range of reactions and emotions: amusement, surprise, exasperation, and impatience. She often said she felt like a spectator rather than a participant. In order for a legislator to be effective, they must be prepared to handle the confusion. They must know and understand the issues. They must be familiar with the legislative procedures and how to apply the rules when needed. They must know how to be familiar with all players and stakeholders involved. Who is for, who is against, what votes are up for grabs, and they must know their own strengths and weaknesses. Mrs. Keyserling understood this all, and while not an expert in some areas, she found allies that could step in when she needed help, once again highlighting the necessity of strong relationships. One last thing we learned from Representative Keyserling is that even if passage of a bill is a sure thing, it does not mean the fight is over. Special interests will lie in wait until the moment is right and characters are in place to resurrect or destroy a bill. Harriet Keyserling served the state of South Carolina for 18 years, 2 years in the Beaufort County Council, and 16 years as the representative in the state legislature. She broke through the glass ceiling, becoming the first woman to represent Beaufort at the state level. She championed the arts, the environment, and women issues. She challenged the status quo in South Carolina. She had a number of accomplishments in public office, with nearly every one of them being an uphill battle. She left office in 1993 and was succeeded by her son, Bill. Harriet Keyserling died in December 2010 and will be remembered as a groundbreaking and effective leader.